Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have lived with Laban as an alien, and stayed until now. And I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves, and I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 companies, thinking, "If Esau comes to one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape." And Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good,' I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number." So he spent that night there, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milch camels and their coats, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he delivered into the hands of his servants, and each drove by itself, and said to his servants, "Pass on ahead of me, and put a space between drove and drove." He instructed the foremost, "When Esau my brother meets you, and asks you, 'To whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you?' Then you shall say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us.'" He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. "You shall say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me." So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent that night in the camp. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle.
Sydney, in Genesis 32, we have this scene of Jacob in a wrestling match with God, it seems like, and that's often called a theophany, but maybe you can help us understand what theophany means.
Right, that's one of those technical words that scholars use that we don't often think about. A theophany means an appearance of God. Theos, phanos, God appears. And how often does God appear in our own lives? Maybe not very often, but in Genesis, God seems to appear all the time to people. And what seems to me so fascinating and what is so appealing to people about the theophanies in Genesis is God feels so approachable. And there you have the idea of God as anthropomorphic. And do you want me to ask?
What does that mean? Yes, that's a big word.
Anthropomorphic really just means like a person. And God walks and talks and gets angry and sits and eats with Abraham. And even in the story of Noah, shuts the door of the ark. And how much more human than that can you get? But yet there's also this side of God in Genesis that's transcendent, way above us, where God, for example, in creation speaks and things come to be. But that immanent, personal side of God is really so appealing in Genesis.
What are some of maybe the big highlight examples in Genesis of God really being sort of very human, being a part of us, and that kind of theophany, that which is called an immanent theophany? What are good examples of that in Genesis?
Well, in the story of Adam and Eve, God breathes his breath into Adam's nostrils. So the idea of God breathing is pretty personal. And then he strolls in the garden, and you get this sense of God just out for his constitutionals, so to speak. Another example would be in the story of Abraham, where God and his companions show up at Abraham's tent, and Abraham prepares a meal for them, and they evidently sit and eat. So you have God eating. Again, how much more human can you get than that?
They just seem like men. I mean, they're people walking around.
And in fact, Abraham doesn't really know it's God until later in the story. And in this story of Jacob that we just heard read, Jacob seems to think, at least at the beginning, that he's wrestling with another human being. And in fact, if Jacob knew it was God, would Jacob have wrestled at all? I'm not sure I would have.
Well, doesn't it say in the story too that the man wrestling with Jacob couldn't overpower him and so had to touch his hip. That's an interesting way of putting it. It's a very human portrait of God there, isn't it?
It's so fascinating, because the idea that, first of all, that Jacob and God can wrestle together, can be in that kind of close physical contact. Who could imagine that God would come down to the human level so closely that God can be touched? And then it goes on to say that neither prevailed against the other. How can we imagine that God and Jacob could be on such an equal footing that they can't prevail, until finally God has to kind of do a trick move almost, and sort of throw Jacob off his balance? It's as personal and close as you can possibly get, and really speaks to a God who is with us in that close personal.
Well, maybe we can talk now too about those personal theophanies. But you have the other kind as well, and especially when you move from Genesis maybe to the book of Exodus, you have different kinds of theophanies. Maybe you can talk about those.
It changes, doesn't it, when you get into Exodus? You get God as very transcendent. God appears in a burning bush, a bush that burns and is never consumed, and Moses is told to take off his shoes. You get God coming down on Sinai in the form of a huge thunderstorm. Rocks crack and the wind blows and the rain pours down. And people are terrified.
Yeah, sure.
One can't blame them.
Yeah.
And then every time Moses goes up onto the mountain, this cloud descends on it and he can't be seen. And the people are left down there below thinking, what is going on? And then Moses comes out of this cloud and his face kind of glows, and he has to put a veil over it so people don't get scared. So that's that transcendent God. And there's a real tension in the Hebrew Bible between the transcendence of God, God is powerful, God is different from the human, and the immanence of God, God as personal, God as like the human. And we feel that tension in those stories, and I think we also experience it in our lives. Sometimes in our lives we feel that God is really transcendent, far away from us, not approachable. And at other times God feels very approachable and God feels close to us. And of course in the incarnation, in Jesus, we talk about God actually becoming human, as immanent as God can be to us.
So the ultimate picture of God's being with us, Emmanuel, God with us, and no one has seen God except through Christ. That's what the Gospels say.
Exactly.
So I mean, how does it help us understand the God of Genesis by looking at this issue of theophany and immanence and transcendence? What do we take away from that, from the book of Genesis, in terms of our understanding of God?
Well, like in Genesis, one of the hallmarks of God, as he's portrayed there, is that he travels with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Joseph. He's not put in one place, and he doesn't stay in one place. He travels with them, and he helps them overcome whatever problems they have. And I think that says something for people who read it today about a God who travels with us on our journeys, no matter where we go. And maybe especially in our own mobile society today, that's more meaningful than a God who's only found in Jerusalem, say, or in our local church.